In this video, we're going to overview the situation, the performance aspects of the theater of the Siglo de Oro, the golden century. It means literally, but we would say the golden age of Spanish drama, which was roughly the same as that of the golden age of the British Renaissance. It just lasted a little bit longer because it didn't end abruptly as the British one had with the establishment of the Commonwealth in 1642. So it took a little while longer for it to play out, as we'll see in the course of this video. So, the Spanish theater was organized very much like the way that the British theater was, around troops. It's very difficult to count exactly how many there were from 1550 to 1600 because there were a lot of mergers and separations, and many of them existed for a very short period of time and then reinvented themselves or went away again or renamed themselves and came back. For that reason, even though the records are fairly complete, they're extraordinarily difficult to tease out and make sense of. We know that in this time there were also extensive tours by the Italian Commedia dell'arte troops, also performing families in a similar way as these Spanish troops, or close to the nature of the British troops. But those were Italian troops that were on tour and were going to ultimately return to Italy. In the 1570s, and then continuing on into the 80s, there was a real outpouring of building of these special playhouses, very similar to the public playhouses in England, but in Spain they were called corrales. And because there was a big increase in the number of playhouses available, there was also a sudden increase in the number of troops. So in the 1580s, and really leading up all the way to the 1600s, there was an enormous number of theatrical troops playing in Spain. In 1603, the government restricted Italian troops completely and reduced native companies to just 8 licensed companies. Now, there were also some unlicensed companies we'll talk about in just a minute. But in 1603, only 8 companies. Now, if you remember, really there were only 2 large companies, the Admiral's Men and the Lord Chamberlain's Men, or what became the King and the Queen's Men eventually, in London. A number of smaller troops, but those 2 big ones. So 8 in Spain is much more, and in 1615 that number was expanded to 12 because they were just not keeping up. These troops played in the major cities of Spain. In London, you'll remember, the theater was really very much located in this one central city, and then the troops would go out some on tours to the countryside, but they were housed only in London. They were all based in London. The same thing is not true in Spain, where there were lots of major cities, and the troops often set up multiple homes, multiple bases in several large cities. They traveled around Spain, and they often even kind of traded places with each other. The main troop of Madrid would go to Barcelona at the same time. The main troop of Barcelona would come to Madrid, so that the repertoire stayed varied. There were really 2 types of companies: sharing troops, compañías de parte, these were sort of like Shakespeare's troops, where there was a group of actors who centrally owned it. And then there were also single manager companies, like Shakespeare's chief competitors, Philip Henslow's company, the Lord Admiral's Men, which became the Queen's Men, in London. Single manager companies hired their actors on 1- or 2-year contracts, where in the sharing troops, the actors, in essence, hired themselves. But both of those types of companies were included in that 8 and eventually 12 licensed companies. They all had to be licensed by the Royal Council. A picture of the play Fuente Ovejuna in modern performance. The theater was subject to censorship. Each play in the repertory had to be separately licensed, exactly as it was the case in England. But interestingly, in England, it was a civil crime to produce a play that had not been licensed. In Spain, the dramatists were subject to excommunication if they didn't comply, if they didn't do what the censor said they had to do, change their plays in certain ways, or eliminate them completely. So it was more of a religious penalty because Spain was still controlled by a religious state that was much, much more powerful. England was already becoming very, very concerned about the power of religion and seeking to reduce it. Before 1590, playwrights were usually actors in their companies. After 1590, such arrangements became increasingly rare. That's partially because that's about the point at which Lope de Vega broke away from the companies that he was writing for, quit being an actor for them. He was churning out plays at such a tremendous rate. You'll remember, we think he may have written as many as 1,800 plays, that he didn't have time to perform all day, and he didn't want to restrict himself to only one company, because he had many, many more plays written than one company could possibly perform. There were other kinds of companies, what we would now call a road company, that were not licensed companies. These were unofficial companies. They dared not play in the major cities where the licensed companies had a monopoly, but there was a living to be made going out on the road. And authorities seem to have not bothered them too much as long as they stayed out of the major cities. In fact, they had a semi-official relationship to the major companies because they often leased plays. They still had to perform licensed plays, plays that had passed the censor. So they had to lease those plays from the official companies or get a hold of them after they had been printed, like the pirates did in England. There's a wonderful novel, unfortunately not translated into English, Entertaining Journey, Villan Durando's novel, that describes this life. It'll be a wonderful student project someday for a Spanish speaker to translate this novel into English. These professional companies were generally hired by cities to perform the religious plays, the autos sacramentales on Corpus Christi, for which they received very high fees. These were sort of like the medieval mystery plays in England, but they continued to be performed in Spain for much longer time, but only around this one holiday. Like we would now think of as somebody kind of putting on a Christmas play, the annual production of Christmas Carol or something. But a company could really make a lot of money. In fact, they could make enough money to survive for a whole year just off this one big performance. They, however, were also contracted to perform their comedias, the more normal, what we would now call dramas. They weren't really comedies. At the Corrales, the public performance house, usually for a flat fee. The city just hired them for a set amount, paid them a certain amount to put on the play. But sometimes the most powerful companies, or companies with a particular popular title or star, got a percentage of the box office that was added. And if they were really, really powerful, sometimes they managed to ask for the box office instead of the fee. They also were getting a per diem for their travel days from the cities that they were traveling to. The size of these troops was about 16 to 20 members, including all the men, women, and apprentices. So the size here is very similar to the company size of the British plays. The King's Men had about 20 active members at any given time. And they had a repertoire of plus or minus 60 plays, also about the same size as the active repertoire of the companies in London. In addition to these 20 actors, they also needed a prompter, a bookkeeper. They needed some kind of costume crew. They needed stagehands, and they needed gatherers, the people who collected the money. We would now think of them as something like ushers, but really they were the people who took your money at the door. Oftentimes those people, the prompters, costume crew, stagehands, and geathers, did not travel from city to city. They were professionals located in the city, and the incoming troops hired them to do work for them on a part-time basis. This word troop is a little difficult to pin down. Some were as small as one person. Some went up to the size as large as 28, the largest known size. But average troop size much closer to 16. In 1646, this is 4 years after the theaters were burned to the ground in London, the corrales, the public theaters, were officially closed in the major Spanish cities by order of the crown, but they weren't burned down. They just were boarded up, and they stayed that way for the next 5 years. But the companies didn't disband. They just went out on the road and continued operations, performing in smaller towns, until in 1651 the ban was lifted and 8 companies were again licensed. Mostly, these new companies were licensed to perform at court, and public performance went into a serious decline. So, the Spanish theater lasted longer than the British theater, which the British Renaissance really came to an effective end in 1642, but it died a slow death, trickling out in Spain from 1646 almost to the 1700s. It just became less and less important in the public eye. Actors were officially labeled infamous, that is, famous for being bad, dangerous, irreligious, literally, and they were banned from receiving the sacraments of the church. But unofficially, the church needed them to perform these sacred plays, the autos sacramentales, on Corpus Christi, and more or less left them alone, including letting the actors not only take the sacraments, but become priests and sometimes deliver the sacraments. As it turns out, one of the ways that the theater stayed powerful in Spain is that an awful lot of charities used theatrical performances to raise their funding, and they needed professional actors to put on these plays and create these charitable performances. Had they not done so, then the church or the state would have had to take on these charities in some sort of welfare. So it was in everybody's best interest to just kind of leave them alone. There were a lot of powerful churchmen, cardinals at the Roman Catholic Church especially, who were very much opposed to using professional actors precisely because they did not like being indebted to them. But the king protected the actors and insisted that professional actors be hired to perform in these autos sacramentales because they did not want religious officials playing the parts, or actors who belonged to the church, actors who were priests in the church, performing these religious plays. They were worried about the power of the church already, and given the sweeping nature of the Spanish Inquisition and its opposition to civic governments, they had good reason to be afraid. The major focus of the religious opposition was this unique factor in Spain that women performed in the theater. In England, they really didn't. It wasn't illegal. They just didn't do it because there was so much social approbation against it. Interestingly, in Spain, there was a good deal of time in which it was illegal. Women were officially banned from the stage in 1596, but it seemed not to have any effect whatsoever. The church put out a ban, said you can't do it, and they did it anyway. So, there you have it, a fascinating sociological phenomenon. In England, it isn't really illegal, but it doesn't happen. In Spain, it actually is illegal, and it happens anyway. In 1598, the church decided, since they'd been ineffective at getting rid of women altogether, that you could perform in the theater, a woman could perform in the theater, but she had to be the wife or the daughter of another actor, of a company member. But that also seems to be generally unenforced. There was a strong rule which it appears did get enforced and was generally obeyed in England, that there could be no cross-dressing by either sex. Men could not play women's parts, women could not play men's parts. Of course, this is the exact opposite of England, where women couldn't appear on stage, so all women's parts were played by, effectively, cross-dressers. In 1608, there came out a decree that only actors could go backstage. This is to keep spectators from visiting the actresses. They weren't very worried about them visiting with the actors, but they were very worried about them visiting backstage with the actresses, many of whom were believed to be courtesans or prostitutes in addition to their duties as actresses. And friars, monks, were banned from attending the theater at all because apparently they had so much trouble avoiding going backstage to meet the actresses. So they had to just be prevented from attending the theater in any way. And there became a much clearer separation in 1608 between religious plays, the actos sacramentales, which had to be performed only in sacred spaces, and secular dramas, which had to be performed only in the chorales, the public theaters. Before that, there had been kind of a mixture of religious and secular dramas in both spaces, and in 1608, that separation became much firmer. In this time period, 1631, towards the end of the time period, actors formed their own guild, what we would now call a union, the Confraria de la Novena. The confrérie, fraternity of the Novena. And this group actually still exists to this day. This group that was chartered in 1631 is still a professional union for actors in Spain, and it was remarkably important in raising the status of actors. You'll remember that this happened very late in the Greek period, too, that actors became part of a guild, the craftsmen of Dionysus, in the Hellenistic period, that gave them some status for the first time. Historically, at least, unions seem to be quite important to actors, and it's worth the status of actors and worth our thinking about in our own time. It certainly was a very active profession in this time period. The University of Valencia has a database that gives us the name of over 6,500 professional actors in this period. Some of them, only known from one or two references, seem to have very short careers, but before 1700, still, in a 150-year or so period, 6,500 professional actors, that's a lot of names. These actors were mostly working-class characters. A very few minor aristocrats crossed over. But for the hidalgo, this was kind of a forbidden pastime, exactly as it was in England. Some of the most famous of actors in this period, the great comedian Damian Arias de Penafiel, a couple of tragedians, Cosme Perez, Josepa Vaca, you notice from Josepa, a female name there, actress that was very famous. It was not an easy life being an actor. We have an idea that maybe life in England was very similar to this for an actor. But actors had to awake very early, sometimes as early as 2 a.m. They needed to study their parts on their own time between 2 and 9 in the morning, because they had to report for rehearsals every morning. At 9, they rehearsed from 9 to noon, took a lunch break, a brief siesta, and back for an afternoon performance. Then they had to clean up after a performance and get ready for the next day's performance, so they were, in effect, their own stage crew. So they had post-performance duties that lasted every day until about 7 in the evening. Well, if you've gotten up at 2 a.m. in the morning, 7 in the evening is getting pretty late. So they would often head off home and to sleep early, although evening performances at court were very common. The king wanted to see his performances as evening entertainments, not afternoon entertainments. And so sometimes these troops were summoned on very short notice, mid-afternoon, let know that they needed to be at court that evening for a performance. It was Philip III who first established the idea of performances at court. Philip III reigned from 1598-1621, but it was his son, Philip IV, that was really the theater nut. Between 1621 and 1665, he was really very enamored of the theater. And you'll remember in the 1640s, the church came down hard against the theater and pretty much outlawed it. So it was only through his direct intervention that the theater managed to last as late as it did, because Philip IV, even if there could be no theater performing in the city, still wanted it available for court. As early as 1626, we began to see much more Italian influence. This is a little later than the Italianate scenery appeared in England under the influence of Inigo Jones. But after 1633, we would say that it was very Italianate, that these indoor theaters had that elaborate scenery that had been developed during the Italian Renaissance. And they also had enormous pageants that were very much like the masks that were held in England. And there you have a modern-day performance of a mask. That's a quick overview of the theater in this time period, just give you a sense of what is going on in Spain in this period that is every bit as interesting and powerful as the theater of England simultaneously.